You're watching the Air and Space Channel.
Since World War I, aces made legends of themselves and their planes as they took part in spectacular aerial duels in the skies. But fighter aircraft paid a price for their speed and maneuverability. With their compact airframes, it was a challenge to stock them with adequate fuel as they trekked deep into enemy territory. But was there a way for fighters to bring their air bases and supplies with them? Could flying aircraft carriers be constructed to deliver an entire fighter force over the epicenter of a combat zone? At the end of World War I, the navies of the world began to recognize the strategic significance of the aircraft carrier. These floating runways allowed a nation to bring a fighter force right to its enemy's doorstep. But fighters at this time lacked the range to penetrate into the heart of enemy territory. Carriers could take them to the coastline, but no farther. But what if aircraft carriers could fly? In World War I, German airships had rained terror upon England in the first strategic bombing raids, causing widespread panic and destruction. The British soon adapted their defenses and developed fighters and ammunition designed to bring down these floating giants in a mass of flames. Alone in enemy territory, these airships were helpless. Between the wars, the Royal and U.S. navies toyed with the idea of converting these airships into flying aircraft carriers. They could, in essence, be modified to carry a small air force with them. The U.S. Navy commissioned the USS Akron and the USS Macon as their first flying carriers. Both these airships were designed to ferry a complement of Curtiss Sparrowhawk biplanes in hangars built within their duraluminum hulls. Launching and recovery of these tiny biplanes was achieved by means of a trapeze mechanism extended from the bottom of the airships. The flying aircraft carrier system proved effective in tests and exercises, but its success was short-lived. Both the Akron and the Macon were destroyed in separate crashes, along with their biplanes, putting an end to the experiments. The development program was terminated.
While the Americans toyed with carriers floating in the sky, the Soviets experimented with fixed-wing carriers. Through a project called Zveno, they chain-linked fighters to a large Soviet bomber to create a mighty war machine. Tupolev TB-1s and 3s acted as the mothership, piggybacking between 2 to 5 Polycar Pol V-16s. It was a symbiotic relationship. The fighters were not only bodyguards. If their engines were turning on takeoff, they could provide an extra boost, allowing all aircraft to carry a bigger payload. Once airborne, the bombers could in turn carry the fighters to target, or serve as flying fuel pumps, thus increasing fighter range. This Soviet SkyCarrier saw limited action against the Germans on the Eastern Front early in the next war.
In World War II, both the Axis and Allies struggled with how to protect their bomber forces as they ripped their way in and out of enemy territory. Although both sides had excellent fighters, many simply did not have the range to serve as escort fighters. Could SkyCarriers be the solution? During the Battle of Britain, Germany's escort fighter deficiency became readily apparent. The Bf-109 was agile and built for dogfighting, but its designers had sacrificed its fuel capacity to create that dexterity. Once over the channel, the Bf-109 pilots had to keep as close an eye on their fuel gauges as they did on enemy interceptors. The Germans did have a purpose-built escort, the Bf-110, which had the range and firepower to fulfill its duties. But it had sacrificed speed to create that range. the Bf-110 was at the mercy of Britain's speedier Spitfires and Hurricanes. Although these two aircraft were flawed, could Germany combine their strengths to create a superior escort? German aircraft manufacturers sought to answer that very question. One simple solution was for the Bf-110 with greater fuel reserves to tow a Bf-109 all the way to Britain. Once over enemy airspace, the host aircraft released the parasite fighter. Free from the tether, the Bf-109 pilot fired up his engine and set about defending the German bomber force from any hostiles. In this instance, the Bf-110 was transformed into a basic SkyCarrier. The designers at Junkers and the German Research Institute DFS took this concept one step further. They explored the possibility of the host aircraft not only towing, but also controlling a parasite escort fighter. In DFS's first experiments, a Heinkel HE-46 with a winch and coupling hook built into its tail was to join up with a Gotha GO-150 with a specially designed nose mount. Unlike the Bf-109 and the Bf-110, the marriage of the two aircraft took place in the air. An HE-46 crew member unwound the kite-like coupling hook until it was a safe distance from his aircraft. The GO-150 pilot then approached from the rear and tried to link up his nose mount with the coupling hook, dangling on the end of the cable. It was a tricky maneuver, requiring a patient and adept pilot. With the GO-150 secure, the HE-46 crew member could reel him in. DFS proved that the two planes could be linked up in the air, but how could the host aircraft control the parasite escort fighter? The plan was for the host aircraft to reel in and operate the parasite via a control shaft extended between the two planes. The designers at Junkers borrowed the winch and air-to-air coupling mechanism constructed by DFS and inserted it into a host Ju-90, along with a receiving aperture. The Ju-90 was to operate a smaller Focke-Wulf FW-58 via a retractable control shaft built into its nose. Once linked together, the Ju-90 pilot could take over flying for both aircraft. This was how the system worked in theory. It was now up to the pilots to prove the concept worked while airborne. Like in earlier tests, the host Ju-90 took off and extended a kite with coupling mechanism from its tail. The FW-58 pilot then had the challenging task of trying to latch onto the coupling. With the FW-58 secure on the end of the line, the Ju-90 pilot reeled him in close enough to join with the control shaft. Once the shaft engaged, the FW-58 pilot could fly hands-off until they reached their target. German designers had created 3 successful carrier systems that might have extended the range of their fighters to provide cover for their bombers, but none were implemented on a large scale. It was a short-sighted decision. When Germany turned its attention to the Eastern Front, they continued to pay the price for their inaction. In 1943, the war was shifting in favor of the Allies. The Soviets, once on the brink of disaster, were launching their own offensive. Soviet industry was able to assemble tanks, munitions, and aircraft unhindered, as the Germans had not prepared for a long-range strategic bombing campaign. Germany simply did not have enough heavy bombers, and their only purpose-built one, the HE-177, was so untrustworthy as to be nicknamed the Flaming Coffin. In this desperate time, the designers at Junkers came up with one of the most bizarre proposals for a bomber of World War II, the Ju-290Z. This aircraft design was unconventional in two senses. First of all, it was a zwilling or twin, meaning two aircrafts were to be joined together at the wing to create one monstrous airplane. In the case of the 290Z, two Ju-290s were to be merged together to produce a formidable 8-engined aircraft. It was hoped that its additional range and power would enable Germany to strike at the heart of Soviet industry behind the Ural Mountains. The only problem was, if Germany launched such a strike, it had no escort fighters with the range and maneuverability to defend the 290Z. It could be obliterated before it even got to target. To solve this dilemma, the designers at Junkers made an even bolder design choice. They intended to marry it with a parasite fighter, the Me-328. The Me-328 was made largely of wood and was powered by either two pulse jets or a rocket engine, the same engine used in the Messerschmitt Comet. It was specifically built to be a mini escort that was either towed or carried by a bomber to a target. The designers at Junkers built a platform atop the Ju-290Z to cradle the Me-328. Once over enemy territory, the mini escort could take off and deal with any approaching enemy interceptors. Though an impressive concept in theory, this SkyCarrier was too radical an idea to put into practice. It never went past the planning phase. The Americans too had initially struggled with how to defend their bombers as they penetrated deep into enemy territory. But rather than building a flying aircraft carrier, they used a more conventional solution. Bombing in the daytime, American bombers were an easy target for German fighters and anti-aircraft batteries. Casualties and losses were high. The P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt didn't have the range to escort the bombers all the way to target or back, at least not initially. But one aircraft would change everything. The P-51 Mustang, with a large internal fuel supply and drop tanks, would become the ultimate escort fighter of the era. It had the range, firepower, and maneuverability to make it a feared defender of America's bomber force. At the close of the war, military planners looked ahead to the future while trying to learn from the lessons of World War II. In August of 1949, America had lost its nuclear monopoly. The Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, and a nuclear war with the Soviets was a scary possibility. America found itself in an arms race with the Soviets, with both sides building long-range bombers wielding atomic weapons. American military planners did not forget how their bomber forces had been shredded by German interceptors in World War II, and they did not want the same fate for their B-29s and B-36s. They also remembered how effective the piston-powered Mustang had been as an escort. But the Air Force was moving into the jet age. They needed a new jet-powered escort to counter any incoming Soviet interceptors. However, speedy jets came at a high price. Jet engines lacked fuel efficiency, and the tiny jet fighters, even with supplemental fuel tanks, wouldn't be able to follow and protect long-range bombers as they ventured into the vast Soviet territory. To deal with the escort fighter dilemma, the USAF resurrected the idea of a flying aircraft carrier. They hoped to carry a fighter force with them, anchored onto the wings or inside the bodies of their B-29 and B-36 bombers. But to do so, they would have to turn to an old foe. Dr. Richard Vogt, the lead aircraft engineer at Germany's Blohm & Voss in World War II, came to the US as part of Operation Paperclip. Known for his ingenious aircraft designs, he came up with an innovative wing coupling system while working at the research lab of the USAF.
The Germans, during the war, had done a considerable amount of work on wingtip towing. What they were doing was, their theory was that you could add anything out on a wingtip of an airplane, and the increased in aspect ratio of the wing gave you sufficient lift to more than counterbalance the increased drag.
In the first experiments with this system, a Douglas C-47 Skytrain was to be coupled with a Culver Q-14 Cadet at the wingtips. The two aircraft would take off separately and then join up at the wings via a ring and lance coupling system. When linked in this way, the Q-14 would still be free to yaw, pitch, and roll on its own. Initial testing took place in August of 1949, but complications soon arose. When the two aircraft came together, wingtip to wingtip, the Q-14 pilot had control problems. So much so that his aircraft ultimately yawed to the right and uncoupled from the C-47. The Q-14 pilot lost control because the two aircraft were influencing each other's lift. The closer they came, the greater the influence and flying instability until the cadet plane uncoupled. Each pilot could adjust their ailerons to attempt to compensate, but in the case of the first test flight, it was not enough. Test pilot John Fitzpatrick recalls the challenges of in-flight hookups.
Some people, the first time they tried it, had no problem whatsoever. Most people, me included, it took a few tries, but pretty soon you got the knack of it, and from then on it was not a problem. We had other people who were outstanding pilots who never, ever succeeded in hooking up.
To minimize influence, in further experiments the aircraft were kept farther apart. The wingtip coupling mechanism was extended by 19 inches to decrease the effect of the wingtip vortex. Though a small change, with the new coupling the joined aircraft could fly together at speeds between 100 and 160 miles per hour, and even make synchronous 50-degree banking turns. Two wingtip programs were given the green light, utilizing bombers and contemporary jet fighters, Project Tiptoe and Project TomTom. Project Tiptoe sought to couple straight-wing F-84s to the wings of a B-29, in much the same manner as the Q-14 and C-47. Republic Aviation headed the project, and testing produced positive results. The B-29 Superfortress was transformed into a flying aircraft carrier, ferrying an F-84 on each wing. While safely coupled, the fighters could switch off their jet engines to conserve fuel. If an enemy aircraft appeared, the pilots could light up their engines again to intercept. Republic next attempted to implement an automatic control system, so pilots were not taxed during these extended flights, but these tests would lead to a tragic end.
They were flying out of the Republic plant on Long Island, and there was to be the first test of the autopilot. Bud Anderson hooked up, could not get his autopilot to engage, so he disengaged from the B-29. John Davis hooked up on the other wing, engaged his autopilot. Immediately there was a hard over, nose up, rolled over, came down on the wingtip of the B-29, knocked half the wingtip of the B-29 off. That airplane went in with its full crew. John Davis flew around for a while, but couldn't get out, and he was killed on landing. And that was the end of that program.
Project TomTom had a similar grim fate. This program attempted to link a B-36 mothership with two RF-84Fs. In September of 1956, an RF-84F tore away from the wing of a B-36. Though no one was killed, the program was deemed too dangerous and the project canceled. Wingtip coupling proved too radical a method for linking escort fighters and bombers. But the USAF still had the greater problem of protecting the bomber force. Other, more conventional ways of hauling a fighter aircraft into combat territory were put on the table, including one involving a Goblin. The XF-85, or Goblin, built by McDonnell, was a tiny jet-powered escort fighter, designed small enough to fit in the belly of a B-36. It was 15 feet long and had 25-foot retractable wings that closed down to 5 feet and 5 inches when stowed in the bomber. The plane had no landing wheels. Instead, it had a hook designed to catch onto a trapeze platform extended from the B-36. Goblin release and recovery experiments began on the 23rd of August, 1948. Although designed to fit in a B-36, they were just coming off the assembly line and not ready for tests. A B-29 was used as a substitute. The smaller B-29 bomb bay could not fully retract the Goblin, but it could at least test the basic concept of releasing and recovering it. Once needed for combat, the Goblin could be lowered to the exterior of the plane via the trapeze system. A giant mechanical hand released the Goblin, freeing the pilot to fire his engines and speed towards incoming fighters. Once his mission was complete, he could return back to the trapeze and ascend inside the belly of the bomber. However, hooking back onto the trapeze was a risky maneuver, and on the first test flight proved disastrous. The test pilot smashed his canopy against the mechanical hand and was forced to make a crash landing. Though the aircraft was badly damaged, this was not the death of the Goblin. After the Goblin was repaired, the team made a second attempt at testing the carrier system. Again, the release of the aircraft went smoothly, but the big test was still to come. This time, the Goblin pilot had better luck. He hooked onto the trapeze and was retrieved into the safety of the B-29. Overall, the system worked, but not well enough to impress the USAF leadership. The Goblin project was rejected, as the tiny XF-85 would not have been able to match the performance of the contemporary interceptors of its era. As well, docking required pilots with exceptional flying skills. The USAF made one last attempt to utilize bombers as aircraft carriers. It was perhaps the least radical of all other ideas put forth, and might have had the greatest chance of success. The project was known as FICON, or the Fighter Conveyor Program. The original goal of FICON was not to convey escort fighters, but rather to ferry a small tactical nuclear bomber over key targets in Soviet territory. The FICON system allowed an F-84 pilot to make a surgical nuclear strike deep within enemy borders, a mission that would have been otherwise impossible. After dropping his bomb, the pilot returned to the B-36 mothership and hooked onto a trapeze arm in much the same way as the earlier Goblin. A trapeze operator then retracted the upper half of the F-84 inside the bomber, where the pilot was free to roam and recover until needed. FICON went into service in the mid-1950s, but its nuclear mission was turned on its head.
There ultimately was one squadron of them, but they were not used for protection. What they were used for photo reconnaissance. The B-36 would get fairly close to the bad people, and then they would send off the RF-84 to take pictures and get back in, since he could go pretty fast.
By the late 1950s, the entire system of flying aircraft carriers was abandoned altogether. The advent of air-to-air refueling meant that tiny jet fighters could replenish their fuel supply several times on the way to a target, whether acting as escorts, tactical bombers, or reconnaissance planes. Furthermore, the arrival of ICBMs made high-flying nuclear bombers a thing of the past. With no fleet of bombers to protect, there was no pressing need to develop a way of ferrying escort fighters into battle. From the Akron, to the Ju-290Z, to Tiptoe, to TomTom, to the Goblin, and to FICON, Airborne carriers always appeared promising as a concept, but it was simply an idea that remained in the clouds. One that was often too complex and too dangerous to implement, and ultimately eclipsed by new ideas and new forms of technology.
You're watching the Air and Space Channel.